Alrighty, well, we're super excited to have you here. I haven't even introduced myself, but I'm Kaylee Corbridge. I'm the Entrepreneurship Club president here at SUU, which is my favorite thing ever. I just love SUU and I love entrepreneurship. So today we have three people on our panel. We have Governor Cox, we have Charles Cooke, and we have President Wyatt. So I'm going to introduce each of those for just a minute. So hear all the wonderful things about them. So Governor Cox is serving as the 18th governor of Utah. He is an attorney and graduated from Washington and Lee University School of Law. He has a huge passion for rural Utah and has partnered with SU to have an office here on campus. President Wyatt is also an attorney that graduated from S.J. Quinry, correct me, President, if I'm wrong, Quinry College of Law and a JD from Utah State University. He is currently serving as the president here at Southern Utah University. Charles C.W. Cooke is the director of the editor of nationalreview.com, co-host of Mad Dog's Englishman, and the author of the Conservatism Manifesto. I have it written down wrong. He knows more than I do for sure. And then he graduated from Oxford in modern history and politics. Today we'll be discussing two questions with our panel. Question one will be civility. Where are we now and why? And question two is where should we be and how will we get there? We would like to end at 6:45, but we're going to turn the time over to the three of these individuals who are going to mediate the conversation. And if you will leave us about 10 minutes for questions at the end, we will do that. So please welcome our discussion panel.
Well, far be it from me to come into the state and speak before the governor.
Well, I would much rather. The only reason I'm on here is to hear from you, Charles. But it's great to be with you, President Wyatt. Thank you. I want to thank Rich Christensen, my good friend. We have so many people at SUU that we love and adore, and I love to have an office on campus and have a son that's attending SUU. So we're big fans of the school and what's happening there, and really excited to have this conversation. So I know we're talking about civility and where we are right now as a country. I think it's interesting that this topic is maybe as important as it's been, at least at any time in my lifetime. And I'm certainly not the first to address this, but it's something that I think about often. It's something I talked about in my inaugural address not very long ago. And we talk about civility, but Arthur Brooks in his book said that if you tell people that your spouse, you and your spouse are civil to each other, they would tell you to get counseling. And so civility is the lowest bar that we should be able to clear as Americans. But the question is, where are we and how did we get here? And I'd much rather hear from the experts. I have several theories on this. We've been getting more and more polarized over time. There are lots of reasons for it. I think at the heart of it, though, is that we're lonelier than we've ever been before. That many of the institutions that were part of the fabric of society throughout the history of the United States and certainly during my lifetime have lost a lot of their their power, a lot of their standing, and these institutions are institutions of higher education, the media, churches, volunteer organizations like the Rotary clubs, those types of groups. There are so many institutions that just don't have their place in society that they once had, and as such, the data is very clear that we know less about each other than ever before. We have fewer real friends than ever before. We know fewer of our neighbors than ever before. And you might ask, well, how does that lead to polarization? Well, we're wired for this type of closeness, and so we look for it, and we're finding it in other places. Unfortunately, we're finding it in the wrong places. If we don't have any real friends, at least we can hate the same people together on Facebook or Twitter. And so it's led us into this sort of tribalism, and politics has filled the role of many of those institutions in that we've become we used to be a religious people that participated in politics, and I believe that politics has become a religion for many of us. And when politics is your religion, then anybody who disagrees with you is almost by definition evil and a heretic. And so we've used this tribalism of politics to find our place, and it's dividing us more than ever. There's so many other threads on this I could pull and talk about, but I've already said too much, and I want to hear from our other panelists, so I'll be quiet for now.
Well, Charles, do you want to go or do you want me to go?
No, please go.
You're smarter than me, so I should. I think that the key piece of civility is that democracy fails if we resort to uncivil behavior. And I think that over the course of the America's history, we've seen times when we've become less civil and more civil and less civil and more civil. It seems to me that there is, it's kind of waves, and it gets to the point that it's really bad, and then people respond and it gets better, and then it gets worse and it gets better. We've certainly had worse times in our country's history. Leading up to the Civil War, we had people beating each other with canes in the Senate, House floor, House chambers. You've all heard those stories. So it has been worse than today, but it's continually trending in the wrong direction. And to me, the issue really is a very pragmatic one. And the issue is, what is our goal? So if the goal is to feel really great about publicly shaming somebody, or to really let somebody have it, I can get on YouTube and look at the titles of different videos. And I think that you all are familiar with this. So-and-so, so the name of a video might be, watch so-and-so totally destroy liberal reporter, right? And so people aren't going to watch that video to learn something. They're going to watch warfare. They're going to watch a skirmish and see their side win and embarrass somebody on the other side. Those things don't take us anywhere. They don't result in anything positive. If you really behave in an uncivil manner, all you do is, it seems to me anyway, all you do is further entrench the different sides and their polarized different opinions. One thing that's very interesting, and I think that this is a part of our history that most people don't know, and that is at the founding of this country, back before Charles was a US citizen, before he was born, before any of us were born, back at the founding of this country, all 13 colonies had established religions. So the Bill of Rights prohibited Congress from having an established religion, but it didn't prohibit the states from having established religions, and they all did. And I could read you a couple little interesting quotes from those early constitutions, but it's not religion that is my point. The point is that religions were established in the states because they believed that religion was one of the sources of teaching civility, teaching high moral behavior, respect, and positive treatment, even though it didn't always happen. But they thought that was one of the sources of teaching it. So from the very beginning of this country, it has been assumed that civility was necessary for a democracy to be successful. And we needed to find all of the kinds of ways that we could. What I see is when people become uncivil, we lose the opportunity to influence or to change people's hearts. And that's the goal. It seems to me that that's the goal. So if we want to affect people's long-term behavior and long-term thinking, we have to treat them the way we want to be treated. We have to treat people in a civil way and give them a reason to want to learn from us. rather than a reason to want to fight us. Anyway, that's kind of some thoughts that I have on this subject to lead it out.
So I agree with almost all of that, and I think especially with the idea that so many institutions have been crowded out, mostly by government, but not always by government, by centralization of other kinds, whether that's Twitter or Facebook or the press, and they've led people to look to governments and politics as they might to a religion, but also to completely tie up their own identities with a political party or a movement, such that when that political party or movement or president is criticized, they feel like they're being attacked too. And this is actually a source of frustration for me as a writer, that through 2 consecutive presidencies now, I get emails that say, I can't believe you criticized the president. Why do you hate me? Well, I don't. Or why do you think I am stupid? It's a silly way of looking at the world. The idea that if you criticize one person or one party or one policy, that you must hate somebody who agrees with it. But it has unfortunately become more and more the way people think. And it is tied to the growth of a big central government that makes huge decisions for everyone. I mean, if you look at the way the country's set up, it's supposed to be fractured. There's supposed to be a lot of power at the local level in cities and states, but also in families and communities and churches and voluntary organizations. And the more you put in one place, the more risk everybody has if someone they don't like gets elected. The more fear people fear when someone they don't like gets elected. And I think we've seen that on both sides a great deal in the last few years. But the other problem is that the incentives now are lining up in the wrong direction. There is a feeling that I've noticed, and it's fascinating talking to people in politics about this, irrespective of whether you're a Republican or a Democrat or a conservative or a progressive, there is a feeling that is almost ubiquitous now that your side is losing and that your side is weak. And it's just fascinating reading, say, the editorials in the Washington Post every day. You could turn the page, and on one page, there's an editorial from a progressive that says, I wish we were real mean and played hardball like those conservatives who get everything that they want and have changed the country into their paradise. And you turn the page, and then there's an op-ed from a conservative saying, I wish we were mean and played hardball like those progressives who get everything they want. Well, when you start to think like that, you actually are giving yourself permission to treat the other side in a certain way, to treat them as enemies, to talk about them as enemies, and to be rude about them and uncivil toward them. And that is made even worse by the strange incentive structure that we now have with social media and much of cable news, where you're going to get more retweets if you say the most outlandish thing. You're going to get more viewers if you say the most outlandish thing. It doesn't really matter to a cable outlet that they might not really be appealing to most people in the country if they can get 5 million viewers every night. You can make huge amounts of money with 5 million viewers every night. And you never have to worry about the remaining 225 million people in the country. And you end up creating these echo chambers. So why are those videos there that says this person destroys? There's actually a video of me on the internet with that kind of title. It certainly wasn't my intention. Why is that there? Because it gets lots of views, because it racks up much more views than here is a really interesting discussion about tax policy. And it is entertaining, but it's not especially helpful. So I don't quite know how that incentive structure changes, but until it does, there's going to be a continuation of the all or nothing approach, because you only really need to appeal to a small group in order to make yourself a success.
Can I ask a question and maybe pull on one of those threads a little bit? You mentioned something that I think is important. And by the way, everything you've said, I completely agree with. But you talked about that government has crowded out some of these institutions. And my question to you, and by the way, it's not this isn't fair because as the president said, Charles is smarter than us, and two, because of his accent, he
Yeah.
sounds 25% smarter even on top of that. So we're at a real disadvantage here. But here's my question. Did government crowd out those institutions, or did those institutions go away and government fill the void? Because Utah's a very special place, and there have been many studies on this. I know Harvard has done several studies on upward mobility, and Utah still leads the nation in charitable giving. Utah leads the nation in volunteerism. Those institutions tend to be a little stronger here than they are in other places, which makes my job much easier as a governor, because I don't have to solve all of those problems, and government was never designed to solve all of those problems, because these institutions were supposed to do that. So I guess, Mike, it's a chicken and an egg thing. Did the institutions go away and then government fill it, and so people look to government, or did government push them out?
Well, I mean, it is a bit of both, as you say. It is chicken and egg. But one of the things that happens throughout history is there are crises. Government steps in, often for good reason, and then it never really relinquishes the power. If you look, for example, at the New Deal, there was no question that the Depression was a crisis. There were millions of people out of work. There were people starving. There were children without clothes. And the federal government completely changed its role as a result. Under Franklin Roosevelt, there had never been a government that did the things that the New Deal government did. And then there was a war. And again, it wasn't a fake war, it was a real war. And it was a war against a real enemy, maybe the worst enemy anyone has ever faced, the horrendous tyranny of the Nazis. But the government then moved from having taken over much of the domestic economy into expanding itself in a way that was unprecedented. And by the time that the United States emerges from that in the late 1940s, there are different rules on the ground. Now, that's not to say all of the institutions had disappeared, but every time there is a crisis and there is a response and government grows a little bit, and there's less room for voluntarism and there's less room for associations than there was before. And it's terrific that Utah stands out, and it does, as Governor Cox says. But it's also the case that there are people within the United States who don't think that's particularly good, who are not wild about civil society or that exceptional nature, and would rather that government did it. I mean, there are people who dislike charity, for example. They think that charity shouldn't exist, that there's something wrong with it. We all know there are a lot of people who oppose religion and think it's sinister and would like to marginalize it. So I think, yes, sometimes government steps in because institutions retreat, but I also think over time what happens is that when governments step in for very good reasons, and sometimes they step in when there is a crisis that civil society can't fix, they never really retreat. And that changes the way that institutions work forever.
Thank you.
Well, and if I can build on that just a teeny bit, and so if government becomes the solver of all problems, then people turn to government, to the topic that we have today on civility. People turn to government to say, force everyone to be civil, which means force everybody to agree with me. I don't want people to disagree with me, or I don't want people to say things that are hurtful. So we turn to government to kind of help solve that, which is in direct conflict with the First Amendment, and delegates to people the definitions of what is appropriate to say and what's not appropriate to say. And that stifles political speech. It stifles the effectiveness of a democracy. And so this is one of the ways that I used to say it, which is if you move off of the farm into a cul-de-sac or into a subdivision, you've got to keep your dog from barking at night, and you've got to listen to your neighbor's dogs bark at night. You've got to force yourself to be good in terms of being a good neighbor, but you have to accept the fact that your neighbors aren't always going to behave that way. And so if you can say, I want to affect positive change, I'm going to be as civil as I possibly can to model good behavior. But when someone else says something that's offensive to me, I can't get offended. I've got to be civil to them as well. That's how we move off of the farm into a city and get along, which is one way of describing a nation or a state. It's just really, really important that we allow others to say what they want to say, but then we model the very best behavior possible. I think that the long-term outcome of that is that we influence others and we become a stronger nation, city, state along the way, stronger individuals. What we see so much in discourse is individuals trying to force people to believe the way they believe. And I think that we've learned through history that that never works. You can't force people to believe a certain way. There's an old saying I've known forever, which goes, a man convinced against his will is of the same opinion still. The best way to convince somebody that they're wrong is to let them feel comfortable expressing opinions, even if they're offensive. Let them bring them out into the open, and then you talk about them. And that leads to good exchange, sharing of ideas. And as one of our principles in this country is that the marketplace of ideas, that if we allow this kind of exchange amongst people, then eventually the good ideas rise to the top, the bad ideas fall out. The countries that have really found themselves in serious trouble are the countries where the government is given the right to determine what can be said and what can't be said, even with good intentions. And that leads us down a very dark path of governmental control, totalitarian regimes. A totalitarian regime is a regime where not only does the government want you to behave a certain way, they want everyone to think the same way. Anyway, that's my rambling.
If I could just add one small thing to that, I agree that having open debate does tend to leave good ideas at the top and bad ideas at the bottom. But one of the mistakes that I think that we've made in recent decades is to assume that we'll all have a conversation and then decide on the best ideas for everyone and then just impose them. And the American system of government is not supposed to do that. There are some questions on which it is supposed to do that. National defense, slavery, thankfully we've resolved that one. Some civil rights. But by and large, most of the questions that we're asked to answer are local. They're healthcare, education, zoning, taxes, roads, priorities that really are not always the same in a state such as Utah than they would be in a state with, say, a coastline, or a much colder state, or Hawaii, which is an island. And if you look back to the original purpose of the federal system, it was to allow people who were quite different than one another to all live under the same flag. They had established religions, as was mentioned, but they also had completely different people in them. The people in Pennsylvania were Quakers, and they had a very different outlook than the people in Massachusetts, who were Puritans or sometimes Unitarians. And they had a different outlook than the people in Maryland, who were Catholics. They had different economies. They came from different parts of Britain, and they had different goals. And the purpose of the system that was built was to allow some leeway so that they didn't all have to agree on how to live together. Yes, there are certain common goals, and no, there are certain policies that can't be sustained, Jim Crow. But on most questions, it is actually fine for Massachusetts to come to a different answer than Utah, and for Florida, where I live, to come to a different answer than California. They can both be good places. They can be filled with good people. They can have different needs. And I worry that we've abandoned that a little bit in search of the right answer. And we're going to elect the right person to be president or senator. And then they're going to decide for the whole country what is best. And the people who agree with it are good, and the people who disagree with it are bad. And I think it's simplistic, and it sort of misses the point of why the system, and such a big country such as this one with so many different people, is set up as it is.
Charles, I think you make a great point, and there are some questions for which we will never all agree, and perhaps we shouldn't all agree. And we know that in our own worlds, because we all know that we don't agree 100% with members of our family and with our best friends, and that's okay.
And if I could, Charles, I mean, this is a great theoretical discussion to be having, and great for political science classes. But guys, I have to tell you, like, this is what I'm dealing with today. I've had 3 different Zoom calls like this, one with the National Governors Association and the Biden White House dealing with vaccine administration, one with the Western Governors Association, and one with the Republican Governors Association today. And I can't tell you how this very topic that Charles has just broached is what we're talking about. Let me give you just one practical example that happened within the past week. So this idea that every state is supposed to be a laboratory of democracy. Again, this is foundational to the Constitution, that the powers really lie with the states, with very few exceptions. And so we get these vaccines, and every governor gets to decide how to administer these vaccines. We've chosen, with a couple exceptions, not to do it based on industry or frontline workers categories. We've decided to do it based on age and underlying health conditions. We've taken a risk-based approach to this, and we believe that we're saving more lives, and the data is showing that out. So we focused on those over the age of 70, and now we have almost 80% of our 70-plus-year-olds who have been vaccinated. Other states went a different direction, but then President Biden comes in and says, well, and we, with one exception, and that exception is we have prioritized teachers, but not every state did that. And the Biden administration came in and said, you know what, we think everyone should prioritize teachers. And so we're just going to mandate that everybody has to prioritize teachers. And you may think that's a good thing. You may think it's a bad thing. Some more people might die because we do that, but we may be, some states may be able to open schools. There are good arguments and bad arguments for and against it. But the truth is, it's a decision that really should, under the Constitution, these types of decisions should be left to the states. And more with every president, everybody who comes in with a good idea. By the way, Republican or Democrat, it happens more with the Democrats, but it also happens with Republicans. Several examples of this during the Trump administration, where they come in and say, no, you know what, we think we know better, and so we're just going to do it our way. We won the election, and we're going to make this happen. And that's not even to mention the divide that's supposed to happen between Congress and the executive branch, which is happening less and less as the presidency becomes stronger, and they use the power of the presidency to impose their will without any congressional action whatsoever. And all of these things that were meant to divide us up in good ways now are not happening because we're consolidating power in a single individual. And that leads to where we are today, with the lack of civility and feeling attacked when our side loses.
I mean, just listening to your comments about news I just want to know if, like, the presidency and the leaders above him are hearing this from our governor. Like, hey, you guys are taking more responsibility than you're supposed to. And if that's like a subject, I'm unaware of that.
I think I heard the question. The answer is yes, that we do have these conversations all the time. In fact, we have several lawsuits. There was a lawsuit filed just today by many attorney generals across the country, including Utah, to push back on some of the new requirements that the Biden administration has put into place. There were many Democrat attorney generals that filed lawsuits against President Trump. But here's the problem. The problem is, even though we all agree when we have these conversations, and when I talk to my fellow governors who are Democrats, they will tell me privately, yeah, we really disagree. We wish they wouldn't do this. But because he's on our team, we're not going to say anything because we won and we kind of like the policy, even though it's the wrong way to do it. So we're going to support it. Republicans did the same thing last time around. And so we're in this terrible cycle where it's like cheering for football teams, but now it's political teams. And if our team if our team is winning, then even if they do things we disagree with or things we know are wrong, we're going to support it anyway. And that's a bad situation to be in, but it's certainly where we are.
So, I mean, we're all students. We're all sitting here listening to you guys and learning from you guys. But not all of us are political science students. Not all of us want to necessarily be politicians or be in that sphere of authority. But what are some things that we can do other than what President Wyatt said and just like modeling the good behavior that we want to see in the world? What are some things that we can do to affect change on the state level, other than just electing like governors or authorities who are trying to push forward this?
Well, I think firstly, you will all, if you're not already, be voters, so you have to demand it. I mean, I'm not obviously a politician. You can demand it of me if you like, but I can't help. And I'm not allowed to be president. So if I ran, it would be the ultimate birth of conspiracy. But you need to be a pretty simple one, right? He was born in England, case closed. But you need to demand it. But really, elections aren't the problem here at the moment. That the culture is. And so just talking to each other, remember that everyone here has an opinion. I mean, I'm sure you do this. I'm not lecturing you about it, but there will be a few people in conversations who will try and hijack them and go with a maximalist argument and scream and shout. And I think increasingly the rest of us just have to say to those people, no, I don't want to talk to you anymore. I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with having very, very strong views. This is a separate question. So if there's someone in here who's extremely conservative or extremely progressive, it's great. There is a lot wrong with saying, I'm going to shout you down, I don't want to hear you, and I'm going to try and get the authorities to silence you. That's the bit that has to change. Because, there are many, many people who have strong views and are just quite happy to agree to disagree and behave like an adult. And I think those two things together will actually help fix the problem. I think the more people who behave properly and then demand of their elected representatives the same. And the last thing I would say, and this is less something you can do than just something I would say to all of you, the number of times that an election is actually the hinge point or a crisis point in American life is pretty small. And I say that as somebody who writes about politics for a living. There have been a few elections that have been all or nothing. 1860, the one that led to the Civil War, that was a very important election. Maybe 1800, depending on how you see it. But every single time now that we have an election, it seems that all the people involved say this is it. If this doesn't go our way, the country is over. And it's not true. It's just not true. And I would give that piece of advice. Just stop listening to those people because they make politics dysfunctional. However passionate people are and should be about politics, believing that makes politics dysfunctional.
I remember when I was in the state legislature, which has been a while, both Governor Cox and I were members of the House of Representatives in Utah. But I remember a lot of times thinking, if every member of the legislature was from my party, we'd be in trouble. Not because our party was wrong or anything. It's just that there really has to be a variety of views. if there was only one right answer to every question, and if we all felt that way, we wouldn't need 435 members of the United States House of Representatives. We'd only need one. What my advice to all of us is to model and practice the behavior that we would like to see in our government. And you, as college students, are in the perfect time to do this because you can do it in a low stakes environment with your roommates, your friends, whatever. You're not necessarily in your careers yet. So you can practice. You can practice this and practice and be successful and fail and be successful and fail, but in low stakes. The further you get into your careers, the higher the stakes get. So practice now, which is when someone says something you disagree with, say, wow, I'd love to understand that. I'd love to understand why you feel that way. Even if you feel deeply offended by it or wounded by it, just, I'd love to understand. So help me understand. If you read Benjamin Franklin's autobiography, you'll see that he shifted his communication from being a know-it-all to being very, very interested in what other people had to say. And he concluded that one of the main reasons for conversation is to learn, not to persuade. And he felt that he became a better person. And what's so interesting is that the more he took that approach, the more persuasive and powerful of an individual he became. Really interesting. The less dogmatic we are in our communication with others, the more open we are to hear other people's opinions. Ultimately, we find that the more persuasive of individuals that we actually are in reality.
This question might be better for Governor Cox, but if your panel members want to chime in, please do so. In the future of the United States, do you guys think it would ever be possible to go away from the dual party system?
Will it ever be possible to go away from the two-party system?
Yeah.
Is that the question? It's a really interesting question. I will say that it's interesting, but the party structure is probably weaker than it's ever been. And we could spend a whole hour talking about political parties and what they mean. But this idea of tribalism is stronger than it's ever been. So again, people are associating themselves with a party or a movement much more so than in the past, and defining themselves by that party or the movement. But the actual institution of parties are weaker than they've probably ever been, at least since parties have been around. Obviously, President Washington warned us about parties and the problems there. I keep thinking that there is room for a third party for sure, and I will tell you that I believe that most of America is in this more kind of fiscal conservative mode. They're really worried about the reckless spending and the way that we do things, but also a little more socially liberal or socially moderate, where they don't want, they don't like people telling us how to live our lives or what to do. And neither party has captured that. There's portions of that in each party. All of that being said, I think it's fairly unlikely in my lifetime that we'll see a third party of any significance. We've seen it tried multiple times. That being said, I never thought someone like President Trump would ever be elected either, and it happened. So I've been wrong about a lot of things recently, but we'll let an expert like Charles. I'd love to hear what he thinks.
Well, in one sense, we do have more than a two-party system, even though there are only two parties. And what I mean by that is that Massachusetts has a Republican governor, and Maine has a Republican senator, and Georgia has two Democratic senators, and so does Arizona. And that's because not everyone in the parties has the same views. I mean, right at the moment, Kirsten Sinema, senator from Arizona, is really upsetting the Democratic Party by saying no to a lot of what it wants to do. Same with Joe Manchin in West Virginia. And about this time 4 years ago, John McCain was doing the same thing to Republicans, and so was Susan Collins in Maine. So there is a lot of difference within the parties. Where this really matters, of course, is at the presidential level. I think given the loyalty that Americans seem to have toward the two parties and the way they are in the system, I think that a far better way to achieve what a lot of Americans want out of a third party is to limit the power of the presidency so that Congress has more power in Washington, and then limit the power of Washington so that the states have more power in the system. The problem with having a two-party system is much more acute when so much of the power is instituted in one person, because at that point, if you're on the other side of the party, you feel really stressed and threatened. That's much less true when Congress has 435 representatives, the Senate has 100. There is a real strategic problem with third parties for the existing parties, in that when one tends to bubble up, it tends to kill one of the parties and make them really angry. And Hillary Clinton in some part lost in 2016 because of the Green Party in the swing states. George H.W. Bush was damaged by the candidacy of Ross Perot. So I think there are other structural ways of achieving the same thing, and that's to look to our institutions as a collection of people who have different views, rather than try and invest all our attention in one person, which is what makes the two-party system a problem.
Well, any last remarks from our discussion panel before we close?
Well, I'll just, since I went first last time, I'll hurry and go first so they can have the last word. I just want to thank all of you for your interest. President Wyatt, thank you. Charles, again, thank you for your incredible work and the journalism, the good kind of journalism that you're providing our country. The things that you've heard tonight, especially from the other two panelists about what you can do in your own lives, I can't stress how important that is. Listening to understand instead of well, first of all, most people don't listen at all, but if they do listen, they're listening to debate instead of listening to understand. What President Wyatt said about that is absolutely critical. And we, our elected leaders are a reflection of us. If we don't like them, then we have to look inside and we have to change. It really is a time for builders. We need people that build up communities, that care about their neighbors, that actually try to make the world a better place. Never watch cable news, ever. I haven't watched cable news in 8 years. It's the best decision I've ever made. I don't watch Fox News. I don't watch CNN. I don't watch MSNBC. Turn it off. They know we're addicted to outrage, and they know exactly how to get us. Same thing with social media. Don't just surround yourselves with people that believe just like you. Listen to others. Encourage that type of understanding, and you'll be a better person because of it. And the last thing I'll say is this: don't fall prey to politicians who use fear and divisiveness to get your support. Reject that at every turn. You're constantly being presented with false choices, right? You either have to love people of color and hate the police, or you have to love the police and reject every accusation of people of color. It's a false choice. Same thing with immigration. Right? It's a false choice. We're constantly being told we have to choose between one side or the other. One's good, one's evil, and it's just not true. Reject that and find people who reject that and vote for them.
I'm not going to say very much because I think that was a terrific summary, Governor. We're fortunate to have Governor Cox in Utah, and I hope that you all read Charles Cooke. He's got some great stuff, and it's really interesting and thoughtful. The bottom line is, if I was to echo something of what the governor said, we all have more in common than we have in discommon. For the most part, all of those in America have the same goals. We just have different ways of achieving those goals. And the different ways of achieving those goals don't make one good and one bad. There's a lot of room for different opinions. And let's do our very best to learn from everybody else and treat everyone with respect. That would be my closing comment. It's a little bit of the golden rule.
I would just say that we are the luckiest people who've ever lived. Firstly, just to live now compared to at any other point. And secondly, to live here. I'm acutely aware of this because I came from somewhere else, and that somewhere else was not terrible. Right? I mean, I'm acutely aware of how wonderful America is, and I didn't grow up somewhere awful, but some people have moved here from war-torn Rwanda or Vietnam in the 70s. And still I'm aware of the unfathomable inheritance that we all have. There is a bit of a tendency at the moment, and it ties in precisely to what Governor Cox said about outrage, to tell people that everything's awful, or it's worse than it's ever been. It's not. And we should be grateful for it and try and preserve it, because really, if you could show this era in this place to anyone who has ever lived in history, they would be astonished, and rightly so.
Thank you so much. If we could give a round of applause to our discussion panel. Please feel free to stick around and have some refreshments. We'll have somebody serving them, so please wait for them to serve you. And then stick around and chat with Charles and anyone else you want to. So thanks for coming.
Hey, and I forgot to say one last thing. Tyler Stillman is a rock star. How could I have forgotten to say that? Anyway, I hope you all enjoy being associated with him.
Thanks, everyone.